Wow. I can't imagine how privileged Mr. Albanese must be. But I do want to impart a little bit of insight as to what it must be like for baby boomer women. Because these grossly unreasonable and disproportionate statements from our leader has not only equalised, but it's also demonised over 2 million women in this country into a fabricated and delusional lucky generation narrative. Not only that, but it's been promoted and loftily used to blame shift and obfuscate from the catastrophic failings of Australian governments past and present. As a baby boomer woman, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, I just want to say, how dare you? This erasure of women's experiences by the Prime Minister to completely efface the prejudices, struggles and wrongs imposed on us, actually his generation, is also a historical collective memory shaped by male officials to conveniently overlook, minimise and ignore our plight, probably for as long as we can remember. The staggering reality for most women of my generation, which is his generation, as Mr. Albanese probably would and definitely should know, could not be further from the truth. Because for the majority of BB women, any aspiration involves simply making it through the systemic and patriarchal societal structures we were forced to endure our whole lives, as well as the gender-based financial discrimination that resulted in us having to claw our way through to retirement. Baby boomer women, on the whole, traversed through a lifetime of symbolic violence, androcentrism, cultural severance, and systemic disadvantage, as well as the motherhood penalty. If through all of that, some of us have, to the point of, after depriving ourselves probably for decades, as well as applied a methodical execution of strict planning, and we have at the end of our lives secured a level of financial self-funding so as to not be reliant on the taxpayer, the younger people, this should in fact be revered, not maligned. Nonetheless, it appears even in our final years we are to be disrespected and mocked with disguised hostility, like the saying, "Okay, boomer." But even more contemptibly, we must take it, another hit from the old boys club. Again I say, how dare you, Prime Minister? How dare you harness this secondary layer of trauma on us, the women of your generation? I have written quite a bit, and I hope you will stay with me as I continue down the road of the truth about what baby boomer women have really lived through in our younger years. Because more disgustingly and insultingly was the temporal dismissal by the Prime Minister, who conveniently shelved the fact that we, baby boomer women, are the demographic with the highest gender pay gap of any age group. We are also the women who did not receive mandatory superannuation until July 1992, and who are, as a result, retiring with up to 30% less super than BB men. Mr. Albanese will be one of those men. Also, the Prime Minister has never in his life had to navigate through intersectionality and double standards. And due to his benefited aspirations and opportunities, is not likely to be one of the fastest growing groups of people experiencing homelessness in Australia, of which we, the baby boomer women, are. BB women have faced outright financial discrimination and control most of our lives, but in our younger years we were denied loans and credit cards. We were mandated to have our husband or father co-sign our transactions, and we were disinherited based solely on our gender, That is the male heir tradition. These deep-rooted patriarchal traditions restricted financial advancement, further enabled by the relentless obstruction of career advancements and being forced to retire upon marriage. So this purported better opportunities and benefited unfairness of our demographic, utilised by Mr. Albanese in his political debates, comes from the same gender base that has never had their reproductive rights, physical integrity, or self-determination taken away by state-sanctioned government officials, then had to live with the diabolical consequences for the rest of their lives. Moreover, was not, based on his gender, dissuaded from a pathway to university with strictly limited subjects for girls, necessitating many, including me, to source further education much later in life. On the other hand, Mr. Albanese's gender was offered more career options and was handed a free education, which we note he did indeed benefit from. BB women, many of us, as with the younger generation, have also accumulated HECS debts, or, like me, the deplorable and unconscionable Student Financial Supplement Loan. It's called the SFSS. It was another government initiative proudly promoted as an assistance for the already financially disadvantaged single parents. But alas, it was in fact a damaging debt trap with hidden interest and debt escalation that, with no reprieve from burden and an unrelenting ATO, has meant they are also paying off today. I only just paid mine off this year, 22 years later. This is combined with the subversion of child support by using tax manipulations such as undeclared income, like cash in hand income, hidden trusts, the redirecting of assets, and my personal favourite, the minimal declaration of income by fathers who owned a business so as to pay paltry amounts in maintenance. It was a known loophole facilitating widespread forms of financial abuse. It was also a methodology the ATO were well aware of, but as with all male-controlled systems, the burden of proof of being wronged fell on the already disadvantaged woman. In the end, it was the children who were robbed a better quality of life as a consequence. But worthy to note, this systemic exploitation overwhelmingly affected separated mothers and forced many into severe economic disadvantage and hardship. Yep, I was one of them. So from one of those female baby boomers of a lucky generation who is currently being described by politicians as having received the unequal distribution of resources, opportunities and economic outcomes, I think it's time to take a trip down memory lane. So we are the age demographic who came from the inhumane atrocities known as the stolen generation, the forgotten Australians and the migrant children from the UK and Malta after World War II. We're the ones who grew up in Australian orphanages, foster care and out-of-home institutions that face systemic physical, emotional and sexual abuse, coupled with the trauma of lost identities and forced labour. We are the women who either sustained appalling mistreatment for falling pregnant when unmarried and were then described as unfit. We were denied financial support and we were hidden in religious or government labour camps dressed up as maternity homes. Or we are their children, sickeningly described as illegitimate or bastards. So the opportunity we were afforded came in the form of a forced and coerced adoption with human rights abuses and or being handed over to unsuitable or abusive couples because processes were expedited on how the adoptive parents appeared financially, rather than by conducting rigorous psychological evaluations and trauma-informed checks. But that's not all. We are also the lab rat children, kids that were tested, many Aboriginal, along with vulnerable youth in state care and orphanages who were utilised as subjects for clinical trials without consent. And we are the women who are historically rooted in the eugenics and population control programs. In fact, we are the generation of women who were used as guinea pigs and who are the recipients of some of the most severe medical disasters in history, such as thalidomide, which caused children to be born with underdeveloped limbs, eye and ear defects, congenital heart disease, and other severe health issues. And or diethylstilbestrol, DES. It's a drug many women were not even aware they were given during a disastrous range of reproductive changes and fertility problems, but not only to the woman, also to their offspring. We are the women, not men, who were at the mercy of a system that allowed us to be put in mental asylums through involuntary civil commitment laws, whereby our husbands, brothers or fathers could legally commit us by simply claiming we were hysterical or unmanageable. Men could just secure a doctor's signature to have us institutionalised without our consent, and for long periods of time, sometimes years, which stripped us of our civil and personal rights. And imagine having that happen to you in today's world. Especially given these hellhole government institutions, called asylums, were filthy, disgusting, inhumane environments with cramped wards, barbaric treatments, and widely known institutional abuse, of which house the mentally ill, the disabled, and vulnerable wards of the state. Yes, children. I personally witnessed in my adult years the remnants of that cruel, atrocious culture on the residents just prior to the final shutting down of the now defunct government facility, Basil Stafford Centre. It was for the severely, and I mean severely, disabled people. It was a facility in close proximity in the Woolston Park Hospital, better known as the House of Horrors. And it was also close to the John Oxley Detention Centre of the infamous Heiner affair. Basil Stafford was just as deplorable, abusive, fostering for decades a culture of abuse and terror on the most severely disabled people, whilst employing systemic abusers and some later convicted notorious pedophiles. Just think about that now. We are the women who had no voice or protectionism in regards to domestic violence and rape, because these violations were not deemed as crimes. They were actually thought of as private family matters. Anyway, husbands were permitted by law to force intercourse because it was their right. And if we were life-threateningly violated, our abuse was more often than not downgraded to family court status to shield the perpetrator from going to jail. Later, much later, we were further insulted by the issuing of the waste of paper domestic violence orders that held no weight or protection whatsoever. I speak from personal experience because I have 6 of them. Moreover, this lack of protective services and legal and institutional realities has been a slow crawl to refurbishment despite the women's liberation movement that we began. Notwithstanding, women's voices then, as they still appear today, were silenced by undeviating tactics to starve our stories of oxygen, deadbat our campaigns, and stifle our input on change. And why wouldn't that be? Given that the Australian Constitution, authored in 1890, which is over 130 years ago, still to this day does not mention women. Our nation apparently was built without a female presence, and it still is today. This is despite Australians going to the polls for changes to the referendum 44 times since its inception. But not one of those times proposed a change to include women. Instead, through generations of suffrage and calling out, as with First Nations people, we still get a long-awaited patchwork of consolation prizes with federal and state legislation in the form of the Workplace Gender Equality Act in 2012, which followed on, how could I forget, from a 1984 Sex Discrimination Act described as the cornerstone of women's rights in Australia. Lucky us. In the end, however, our rights to an identity and for our democratic participation is still not even recognised in our Constitution. But I digress. I'd like to go back to Mr. Albanese. You are our leader. I am taken aback, as are the people that are in the female section of the baby boomer generation. We cannot believe that you use these sweeping statements. Maybe I should go back to them. Or maybe I won't, because just saying them upsets me. Mr. Albanese, you are not one of the 3 women who to this day has been sexually violated by the age of 15. It's a statistic that the female BB generation is very much a victim survivor of, with many only speaking up about it now. But more relevantly, you have not had to anxiously and helplessly face the horror for decades at the extermination of his own kind. Week after week, with no end in sight, or likely come close many times yourself. On top of that, you haven't had to suffer the financial setbacks and hardship as a consequence of the violence against you. Mr. Albanese, you are unlikely to have had nowhere to go with children or been dragged down to a cold, intimidating, utilitarian police station late at night with frightened and traumatised children, all the while nursing a black eye, an arm that is likely broken, and a road ahead full of fear. What is more, you have probably not been further beaten down by a justice system run on the shame and disparagement of your gender, or, as with First Nations women, had a life marked by systemic state-sanctioned practices of coercive sterilisation, financial exploitation, and denigration of motherhood, all the while being fed rhetoric from governments about change. Yes, we, the women of the BB generation, also represent the anticipators to the Blue Ribbon Panel. It's been over 50 years of these political promises served up in a plethora of performative reports, wordy task forces and inquiries on domestic violence, rape and child abuse issues since the late 1960s and early 1970s, which continue to affirm the mass slaughter inflicted on women and the most vulnerable humans in this country every week, that is children. These crimes against humanity continue to escalate nationally, in spite of Australian governments and public officials producing hundreds upon hundreds of reviews, investigations, royal commissions, commissions of inquiry, research and policy papers, thesis, statistical data, and more paperwork than a forest of trees can generate on the prevention and abolition of violence against women, Aboriginal affairs, and child abuse in all its forms. On top of that, it's costed hundreds of millions of tax-paying dollars. But in the end, are all theatres of power which do make policy, but which do much else besides. Worse still, these so-called blueprints for change of rehashed, mostly unfulfilled recommendations with the same findings. I'll give a few, such as the importance of responding to over-representation of Indigenous children, the importance of a national media campaign, the importance to destigmatise and create education and prevention, to ensure early intervention in almost every decades-old report, parent education programs recommended as long ago as 1974. Then there's the one about money, and then there's training, and more training. If I have read that once, I've read it a gazillion times. But all of them have no scrutiny, no follow-up, and no accountability by the officials for the blood on their hands failures. No political experiment has been tried so widely with so many disparate people in Australia and failed so absolutely and catastrophically. Meanwhile, 30 years after the findings of the Royal Commission into Deaths into Custody were handed down, there are still calls for most of the 339 recommendations to be implemented. When will the inertia stop? Getting back to us baby boomer women, there's a little bit more to our story. Whilst our younger days may have looked like the golden age of unsupervised play, we were also the children who grew up in an environment of strict obedience, harsh discipline, and respect for authority, regardless of the abuse that authority was doling out. We were not to question, seen but not heard, and often received cruel and often sadistic corporal punishment for what is considered today to be child's play, going through a phase, self-expressionism, or for expanding rightful knowledge by asking questions. Unfortunately, collective punishment reigned, and as a result, we were belted for things that we often did not do and caned at school for not being diligent enough. In my case, for example, I had a cigarette lighter thrown at my head for not paying attention, and I was caned for not going to the toilet during lunchtime. My punishment was compounded by the humiliation of when I could not hold on and urinated in the class. I was 6 years old when I was made to mop up under my chair in front of my peers, stay in the same wet, smelly clothes in the middle of winter and for the rest of the day, and I received 6 of the best, that is the cuts. In addition, this was a time when blind-eyedness to child abuse in all its forms was not only a natural course of action, but the guiding comfort for systemic pedophilia. The Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse has confirmed just how systemic and horrific that was, inside institutions and out. Yes, I am one of those children too. How fortunate I was. In the 1980s, when our millennium children were born, we had a little way in the labour-saving devices that everybody seems to have today, and we had very few childcare options. Again, there's quite a few more these days. And at the time, we were wading through we were in knee-deep waters because the worldwide AIDS pandemic sort of came along, and that was combined with the misconceptions and the vilification of targeted groups, the fear of being contaminated by blood transfusions, the stigmatising of postnatal depression, the archaic property laws, a stock market crash, and more. They all launched us into the next decade. In January 1990, we were hit with a 17.5% interest rate. And that was a difficult time. It was a time when my mum lost her house to the bank and she never got another one again. Anyway, getting back to the 1990s. The 17.5% interest rate was also at a time when we went into the third recession, the recession that we had to have. This was the decade, interestingly enough, when women were then sold off by two more blokes in government in a Contra sweetheart deal by another former Prime Minister and religious zealot senator. It was called the Harradine Amendment, a deal that required a vote from an independent for the Liberals to shore up the privatisation of Telstra. Senator Harradine offered up his vote, but only on the proviso the government banned the early termination drug RU486. I think it's called mifepristone. And in doing so prevented women of Australia access to non-invasive, non-surgical process that would have been completed in private and very early on. Not only was the drug to be banned, but family planning was restricted in its counselling toward any terminations. Some states had illegal abortion laws at the time, requiring backyard, expensive and life-threatening procedures. Yep, I was one of those women too. As a single mother, living on welfare and after being raped by a former partner. This immoral travesty, generated and enforced by two male officials who would never feel the devastating impact of that deal, was amplified to me over and over in my work life when I was working later with homeless and at-risk youth, whereby I would assist very young, often 12 and 13-year-old girls. And many times, after they'd been family member raped, it was my job to assist them in finding the finance and support to access traumatising surgical procedures that should have been resolved with a pill. No other drug was subjected to this ministerial veto, and Harradine was seemingly unmoved by the statistics that show that a woman dies every 8 minutes in the developing world as a result of unsafe terminations. More sickeningly, women throughout Australia, like me, watched as the ever-supportive men in suits gave Harradine a taxpayer state funeral in 2014. Then, at the same time, all around the same time, Viagra for men's erectile dysfunction was streamlined due to its status as a medical breakthrough and entered the Australian market in September 1998, just 6 months after its US approval, not the usual 10 years that we have to wait. So to the younger generation who would listen, I would like to say something. Please let it be known, our hearts do indeed bleed for today's younger people, who, by the way, are our precious children and grandchildren, striving to access what should be a fait accompli in this first world country, that is a home. Also, whilst you're struggling with exorbitant costs of living, HECS debts, and a whole lot more, we, the supposed more fortunate older citizens, not only understand, but we sincerely sympathise, because we are the lived experience of many feckless governments who have failed us, caused more unnecessary hardship, and used finger-pointing and scapegoating on citizen groups like us as their fall guy. Many of these groups include immigrants, the LGBTIQA community, First Nations people, welfare recipients, feminist activists, and the anti-war left, the hippies, just to name a few. These citizens groups have suffered through decades of wrongs as a result, and they, like us, the baby boomer women and men, we're not to blame. The failures and incompetence, yet again, lies with short-sighted, self-serving officials who, despite disparity improvements, is manifestly controlled by male majority in senior positions of government. We also understand this impassable chasm and increasing disrespect on us, the older Australian, may well be deserved for our cognitive dissonance, eco-paralysis, and self-absorption distraction in regards to many issues, but in particular, protecting the planet. I know I feel so guilty for not taking notice for not being more aware, for not acting better. I believe we are also guilty of the moral decoupling of our leadership and for falling into line with the cultivation theory. One, through indoctrination, has had us in a drone state for decades. It is a sedition many of us are finally waking up to. And for these faults and deficiencies, as we look into the eyes of our grandchildren, are truly and heartfelting, with no excuses. Sorry. So on behalf of baby boomer women, I ask you, consider the disparities we have endured and grant us the recognition at least for being the generation of women who have also fought hard to dismantle the structural and cultural double standards consigned on women, as being the generation that actually broke the glass ceiling and affected some of the changes in workplace equity, economic independence, access to contraception, rape law reform, and more. I ask you just to flip the channel just for a moment and consider the notion we may be one of Australia's most under-recognised assets at this point in time. Me and my baby boomer sisterhood. Because the negligent, egocentric, deceitful governments who have failed the Australian people in accessing their own dwelling means that many of us, without question, have had to step up big time by putting aside our long-awaited retirement freedoms and savings to be that bank of mum and dad. Some of us have used our home equity for a house for our kids. We're cashing in investments and then loaning it without interest. Many of us are covering the cost of HECS debts, doing the lion's share of childcare because maybe that's all we can do. But hey, we're in the trenches. Many of us are accommodating adult kids living at home much, much longer. And often, many are returning home with their partners and children, our grandkids. This is all as a result of severe housing shortage and the excessive cost to buy, which isn't driven by us. It's driven by the fundamental economic law of supply and demand. It was a serious situation flagged to governments many times by the early 2000s, with an official sounding alarm in 2009, as was the need to build more social housing and governments which had, in their inimitable wisdom, sold off decades before. Excuse me. Please try to understand. For many BBs, the purchase of an investment property was not to get rich, but to avoid poverty. I couldn't be like my mum. And also to prevent being reliant on the government coffers, that is the younger generation's taxes. We are, after all, the largest population retiring at one time. Nevertheless, given the critical housing crisis we are experiencing as a consequence of that dereliction of duty by governments to address what was forecast over a generation ago, and before the 4 times high increase in immigration, which is not to say we do not welcome, but means those we rely on to accommodate have let us down. Just for the record, I am indeed a baby boomer woman who has finished up with owning my own home. I also bought property to fix up, rent out and invest. But I went from generational welfare, no inheritance, and like Mr. Albanese, a single parent home. I came from horrific child sexual abuse, escaping a domestic violence as an adult, living in a car with children, living in a tent for many months. I lived in my mother's garage, who she didn't even own the place that she was in, to turning my life around at age 40. I have to say though, it was never as a consequence of having benefited from aspiration and opportunity in my young years, but nor my older years for that matter. Because even by then, after I had worked in fields of high-risk exploitative labour out of desperation and saved everything I could, I was still refused point blank a loan by every one of the main 4 banks and building societies despite having never defaulted. My opportunity was begged for by way of a restricted loan amount, it was a really small loan amount, through a much higher interest cooperative that applied a punitive fee every month due to my supposed high risk as a single mother. It was, in fact, sheer draft, necessary deprivation, and there was a lot of that, self-financial education, tenacity, hard graft, and pushing through the entrenched systemic structural norms despite the numerous slapdowns that got me here. Although it was a rocky road of adversity and obstruction, by the gender whose states I benefited, I will not be made feel guilty for the position I am now in and fought so hard to get to. What I absolutely do know is that despite the horrors I lived both as a child and as a young adult, I know I am still more privileged and less hard done by than many other women of my age, not because of my supposed generational opportunities, but simply because I am non-Indigenous and was not a child who grew up in institutional uncare. If you have made it this far, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to listen to one of Australia's seemingly invisible citizens. I want to end by saying this is about breaking the chains of official wrongs, including the gross misrepresentation by the Prime Minister for a generation of women who have had anything but a life full of aspirations and opportunities. Thank you.